mean I'll see it.
I've never really told anyone the full version of this story, mostly because when you tell people you heard a voice that wasn't there, they start looking at you like you've lost your mind. But I know what I heard, and more importantly, I know what I saw in the weeks after the police finally finished their sweep of our old house. This isn't some campfire story about a ghost or a lady in white. This is about the night I realized that the person I trusted most in the world, my dad, was being used as a lure by something very real, very human, and completely out of its mind. I was 10 years old, which is that weird age where you think you're basically an adult, but you're still secretly terrified of the basement light being turned off. It was the early 2000s, and my parents had decided I was finally responsible enough to stay home alone for an hour while they ran to the grocery store. I remember the feeling of the house when the front door clicked shut. It wasn't a bad feeling at first. It was that sudden, heavy silence that feels like freedom. I headed upstairs to my bedroom to play with some action figures, leaving the hallway light on because, like I said, I wasn't as brave as I pretended to be. The sun had started to set, casting these long, orange, distorted shadows across my carpet. Everything was normal. I was lost in my own head until the silence was absolutely shattered. Lil. The voice boomed from the bottom of the stairs. It wasn't a whisper or a suggestion. It was a scream. It was my father's voice, and he sounded beyond livid. He was the kind of guy who rarely lost his temper, but when he did, his voice had this specific, chest-vibrating resonance. And he used that nickname, Lil. It was a shortened version of my middle name that he only used when I was in massive, life-altering trouble. Like if I'd broken a window or started a fire. The sound of it sent a physical jolt through my spine. My heart started hammering against my ribs so hard I could feel it in my throat. I didn't even think. I didn't question how they got back so fast or why the car hadn't made a sound in the driveway. It was a Pavlovian response. I bolted out of my room and toward the staircase, my mind racing through every bad thing I might have done in the last 24 hours. Dad. I called out as I reached the top of the landing. No answer. The downstairs was a cavern of shadows. Because the sun had gone down, the living room and the kitchen were swallowed in this thick, murky blue-black darkness. I started walking down the stairs, my palms sweating against the wooden railing. Every step I took felt heavier. The air in the house felt different. It felt wet, if that makes sense. It felt like someone had been breathing in the hallway for a long time, turning the air humid and stale. When I reached the bottom floor, I stood there for a second, straining my ears. I expected to hear the rustle of grocery bags or the jingling of keys. I expected my dad to walk out of the kitchen with that stern look on his face. But there was nothing. The silence was so absolute it actually hurt my ears. Dad, I'm down here. What did I do? I walked toward the front window and pulled the curtain back just an inch. The driveway was completely empty. The street lamp was flickering outside, casting a cold light over the gravel where their car should have been. My stomach didn't just drop, it felt like it turned into ice. My parents weren't home. They weren't even in the neighborhood yet. That's when the first wave of real, visceral dread hit me. It's that feeling where your skin feels too tight for your body. If my dad wasn't home, who had just screamed my secret nickname from the dark at the bottom of the stairs, I stood frozen in the living room. I was too scared to run back upstairs and too scared to stay where I was. Then I smelled it. It was a sharp, copper scent mixed with something like unwashed hair and old, rotted meat. It was coming from the direction of the kitchen. I took a small, shaky step toward the kitchen, and my foot landed in something wet. I thought maybe the dog had had an accident, but when the light from the street lamp hit the floor, I saw it wasn't yellow. It was dark. Thick. It was a trail of something viscous that led from the kitchen door right to the spot where I had heard the voice. I followed the trail with my eyes, and they landed on the basement door. It was cracked open just a sliver. Maybe 2 inches. From behind that door, I heard it again. But it wasn't a scream this time. It was a wet, rhythmic sound, like someone was dragging a heavy piece of raw steak across a wooden board. And then a voice, my dad's voice, but wrong, started to mutter. It was repeating my nickname over and over again, practicing the inflection. Lil. Lyle. The voice started to change. It began to lose that fatherly resonance and turned into this high-pitched, strained wheeze. It sounded like someone was pulling a violin bow across a rusted wire. I realized then that it wasn't a ghost. A ghost doesn't leave a trail of blood and bile on the linoleum. A ghost doesn't smell like a slaughterhouse. I backed away, tripping over the edge of the rug. I scrambled backward on my hands and knees, my eyes locked on that sliver of darkness in the basement door. A hand reached around the edge of the door frame. It didn't look like a normal hand. The fingers were impossibly long, the skin pulled so tight over the knuckles that it looked like it was about to burst. The fingernails were jagged and stained a deep, crusty brown. I didn't scream. I couldn't. My lungs felt like they had collapsed. I did the only thing a terrified 10-year-old brain could think to do. I slid under the heavy, velvet-skirted couch in the living room. I grabbed a plastic toy sword that was lying there and clutched it to my chest, my face pressed against the dusty floorboards. I watched those feet walk into the living room. The person, or whatever it was, wasn't wearing shoes. The feet were pale, bloated, and covered in those same dark stains. They moved with a strange, jerky gait, like the person didn't quite know how to use their joints. They stopped right in front of the couch. I could hear the person breathing. It was a heavy, wet rattle, the sound of someone whose lungs are filling up with fluid. Then, the thing knelt down. I saw the face press against the floor as it tried to look under the couch. I only saw a glimpse before I squeezed my eyes shut, but that glimpse burned into the back of my eyelids. It was a man, but his face was a map of self-inflicted horror. He had used some kind of wire to pull his cheeks back into a permanent, horrific grin. His eyelids had been turned away, leaving his eyes wide, dry, and bloodshot, staring intensely at nothing. He looked like he had been living in the dark for years. Lil, he whispered. He wasn't using my dad's voice anymore. He was using a voice that sounded like tearing cardboard. He knew I was there. He was just savoring the moment. He reached a long, trembling arm under the couch, his fingers brushing against the fabric of my shirt. The smell was overpowering now, the smell of an open wound that had never been cleaned. Just as those cold, wet fingers started to hook into my sleeve, the sound of a car pulling into the driveway shattered the tension. The headlights swept across the living room wall, blindingly bright. The thing under the couch let out a sharp, hissed breath. It retracted its arm with a sickening, slithering sound and stood up. I heard its bare feet slapping against the hardwood as it bolted back toward the kitchen. By the time the front door opened and my parents walked in, laughing about some joke on the radio, the house was silent again. I didn't come out from under the couch for 20 minutes. My dad had to practically drag me out. I was hysterical, pointing at the kitchen, screaming about the voice and the blood. When the police came, they found the trail. It didn't lead to a body, thankfully. It led to the crawl space behind the water heater in the basement. Inside, they found a nest. It was made of old clothes stolen from our laundry, scraps of food, and this is the part that still keeps me up, dozens of cassette tapes. The man had been living in our walls for months. He had been recording our conversations, playing them back over and over again to learn how to mimic our voices. The blood on the floor, it was his own. He had been performing surgeries on his own throat and face with a rusty utility knife, trying to reshape his anatomy to better match the pitch of my father's voice. They found pieces of discarded skin and cartilage in a glass jar next to his sleeping bag. They never caught him. He had slipped out to a ventilation grate before the police arrived. The worst part isn't that he was in the house. worst part is that every now and then, I'll get a voicemail from an unknown number. There's never any talking. Just the sound of someone breathing, a heavy, wet rattle, and then a single word, spoken in a voice that sounds exactly like mine. Lil. I don't stay home alone anymore. I don't think I ever will. Because I know that out there, somewhere, is a man who spent months carving his own face just so he could call me by my name. And he's still practicing.
Next story.
I never really believed in the stuff people post on these forums until I spent a summer helping my grandpa, Jerry, move out of the house he'd shared with my grandma for 40 years. She passed away a few years ago, right at the end of 2021, and the whole thing was just ugly. Cancer is a special kind of hell. It doesn't just take the person, it erodes them. By the time she finally went, she didn't even look like herself anymore. She was just a collection of sharp bones and yellowed skin, smelling like copper and antiseptic. During those last few months, the house became a makeshift hospital. My grandpa had set up this cheap baby monitor in the living room because that's where her hospice bed was. He couldn't be with her every second of the day. He had to eat, he had to use the bathroom, he had to try and sleep, so he kept the receiver clipped to his belt or on his nightstand. He lived in fear of missing her last breath, or worse, missing her calling out for help when the pain got too bad. After she died, you'd think he'd throw that thing in the trash. But grief does weird things to your head. He kept it. He kept it plugged in on the kitchen counter, and he kept the receiver on his nightstand every night. He told me once, over a beer when he was a little too honest, that the static was the only thing that helped him sleep. It was like he was still waiting for her to need him. The house was too quiet without the sound of her struggling to breathe. For months, it was just white noise. That soft, rhythmic crackling of a radio frequency picking up nothing but the empty air of a living room where no one sat anymore. He'd cleaned the place top to bottom after the funeral, but he said he could never get the smell of the sickness out of the carpet. He described it as a sweet, rotting scent, like fruit left out in the sun, mixed with the metallic tang of the blood she'd cough up into those little plastic trays. Then, things started feeling off. My grandpa isn't the type to imagine things. He's a retired mechanic, a guy who deals in logic and cold hard facts. But he started telling me that the house felt heavy. He'd be sitting in the kitchen and feel a sudden, freezing draft, even though the windows were sealed tight. He'd see movement in the corner of his eye, a shadow that looked a bit too much like a person sitting in the recliner, but when he looked, there was nothing but the sunlight hitting the dust motes. One night, it reached a breaking point. It was late, maybe 2 or 3 in the morning. He was lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to that familiar hiss of the baby monitor. It was the usual sound until the static suddenly cut out. The silence was absolute. He said it felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. And then, through the plastic speaker of the receiver, he heard a sound that made his heart nearly stop. It was the sound of a heavy, wet cough. The kind of cough that comes from lungs filled with fluid. It was followed by the unmistakable sound of someone shifting under the sheets of a hospital bed, the crinkle of the plastic mattress cover, the groan of the metal frame. He sat bolt upright, his skin crawling. He told himself it was just interference. Maybe a neighbor had bought a monitor and the frequencies were overlapping. But then a voice came through. It wasn't distorted or faint. It was clear. It was her. Jerry, I'm thirsty. He said he forgot everything in that moment. He forgot the funeral. He forgot the casket being lowered into the dirt. He forgot the 3 years of watching her wither away. All his brain registered was that his wife needed him. He lunged out of bed, his old knees cracking, and he ran down the hallway. He didn't even turn on the lights. He just burst into the living room, his voice already forming the words, "I'm here, honey, I'm right here." The room was pitch black. He hit the light switch, his eyes squinting against the sudden glare. The living room was empty. The hospice bed had been gone for months. There was nothing there but the old recliner and the coffee table. The silence of the room was deafening, but the smell, he said, that was the worst part. The smell of the cancer was back. It was thick, cloying, and visceral. It smelled like decaying meat and stale medication, so strong he had to cover his mouth to keep from gagging. He stood there for a long time, trembling in the middle of the room, waiting for another sound. But there was nothing. Just the empty, cold air. When he finally walked back to his bedroom, his heart still hammering against his ribs, he looked at the baby monitor receiver on his nightstand. The little green lights on the top were jumping, spiking into the red as if someone was screaming into the other end. But the speaker stayed silent. No static, no voice. Just those flickering red lights, reacting to a sound he couldn't hear. He didn't sleep the rest of the night. He sat in his chair with a shotgun. Across his lap, watching the door. It wasn't that he thought it was his wife anymore. The realization had set in that whatever called his name wasn't her. It was something else. Something that knew exactly what he wanted to hear and used it to bait him into that dark room. The next day, he took the monitor and the receiver out to the backyard. He didn't just throw them away, he took a sledgehammer to them. He smashed the plastic until it was just a pile of white shards and tangled wires. He told me he felt like he was being watched the whole time he was doing it. Like something was standing just inside the sliding glass door, disappointed that the game was over. He never heard the voice again. But that's not the part that haunts him. It's the silence that followed. He realized that for a few seconds, he'd actually been happy. He'd been thrilled that she was back, even if she was suffering. And the cruelty of that, the way his own grief had been weaponized against him, broke something inside him that never quite mended. He moved out a month later. He couldn't stay in that house anymore. He said that even with the monitor gone, he could still hear the faint sound of that wet, rattling breath coming from the floorboards every time he walked through the living room. The doctors call it a residual haunt or some kind of psychological break brought on by extreme mourning. They say the brain tries to fill in the gaps left by a lost loved one. But my grandpa knows what he heard. He knows the difference between a memory and a presence. Whatever was in that house, it wasn't a memory. It was something that had been waiting in the corners, feeding on the misery of her slow death, and it didn't want to let go of the only person left to torment. He lives in a small apartment now, a place with bright lights and no history. But sometimes, when we're sitting together and it gets too quiet, I see him glance toward the hallway. He's listening. He's always listening, terrified that one day, he won't even need a baby monitor to hear her calling his name again from the dark.
Next story.
I've spent a long time trying to convince myself that what happened was just a series of coincidences, or maybe some kind of psychological break brought on by the heat and the drinking. But the truth is, I know what I felt. I know that sensation of something cold and heavy dropping into the back of my mind, like a stone falling into a deep, dark well. It wasn't a sound. It didn't come through my ears. It was just suddenly there, a thought that wasn't mine, vibrating with a kind of absolute, terrifying authority. It was the end of summer, one of those nights where the air is so thick and humid it feels like you're breathing through a wet cloth. We were at a house party out in the sticks, the kind of place where the driveway is just gravel and dust, and the trees crowd in so close you feel like the forest is trying to reclaim the yard. Everyone was there, my best friend, his younger brother, and their dad, who had shown up late to give them a ride or maybe just to see if the beer was actually as cold as we said it was. The mood was high, loud music bleeding out of the open windows, the smell of wood smoke and cheap lager hanging over everything. My friend was leaning against his car, laughing at some joke his brother had just made. He looked so full of life, so permanent. You know that feeling when you look at someone you've known forever and you just assume they'll always be there? Like they're part of the landscape? That's how he was. He was tossing his keys from hand to hand, the metal clicking rhythmically, a sound that usually wouldn't bother me. But then, it happened. The air around me seemed to suddenly lose all its oxygen. The music from the house faded into a dull, underwater hum, and the laughter of the people around us became distorted and shrill. That's when the voice dropped in. It was calm, so calm it was sickening. It didn't have an accent or a tone I recognized, but it felt ancient. It said, quite clearly, "Don't let him go. This is the last time." A physical pit opened up in my stomach, a cold, oily sensation that made me feel like I was going to be sick right there on the gravel. I didn't think. I just moved. I lurched forward and grabbed the edge of my friend's car door just as he was about to pull it shut. My knuckles were white, and I was gripping the metal so hard the edge dug into my palms. I remember the way he looked at me, eyebrows raised, a half smirk on his face, his eyes glassy from the night's festivities. I tried to find words, any words, to make him stay. I wanted to tell him the car felt wrong, or that the roads were too dark, or that I just needed him to help me with something inside. But my throat felt like it was filled with dry sand. All I could do was stare at him with what must have been a look of pure, unadulterated terror. He just laughed and shook his head, reaching out to gently pry my fingers off the door frame. He told me I was being weird and drunk, and that I should go inside and get some water. He slammed the door, and the sound of the latch clicking into place felt like a coffin being sealed. As the engine roared to life and the tires kicked up a cloud of gray dust, I stood there, paralyzed. I watched the red glow of the taillights as they retreated down the long, winding driveway, weaving between the suffocating lines of pine trees. And then, as the light finally vanished into the blackness of the woods, I heard the voice one more time. It was softer now, almost a whisper, but it carried a weight that made my knees buckle. Too late. I didn't go back to the party. I couldn't stand the sound of people having a good time. I walked to my own car and just sat there in the dark, the silence of the cabin feeling like a heavy shroud. I waited. I didn't know what I was waiting for, but I knew the night wasn't over. I knew the world had shifted. The phone call came when the sky was just starting to turn that bruised, sickly shade of purple that comes before dawn. It was another friend, someone who had left the party shortly after they did. His voice was unrecognizable, high-pitched, frantic, punctuated by wet, gasping breaths. He couldn't even get the words out at first. He just kept saying my friend's name over and over again, followed by a sound that I can only describe as a sob being choked back. I drove to the site. I don't know why I did it, but I felt like I had to see the reality of my failure. The police hadn't even finished cordoning off the area when I arrived. The scene was something out of a nightmare, a visceral display of what happens when physics and mortality collide with absolute violence. The car hadn't just crashed, it had been dismantled by the impact. It had hit an old-growth oak tree on a sharp bend, and the force had been so great that the engine block had been pushed back into the front seats. The metal was twisted into jagged, impossible shapes, glistening with a mixture of spilled oil and something much darker, much thicker. The smell. It was the smell of hot iron and gasoline, a copper tang that coated the back of my throat. I saw things I shouldn't have seen. Things that no one should ever have to see. I saw the way the father had been thrown, a broken, limp shape against the rough bark of the tree. I saw the younger brother, his face a mask of red, eyes wide and fixed on a sky he couldn't see anymore. But it was my friend that broke me. He was still in the driver's seat, or what was left of it. The steering column had pierced through him, and his head was tilted back at an angle that no human neck could sustain. In the strobe light of the emergency vehicles, his skin looked like gray marble, slick with the gore that had sprayed across the interior of the cabin. The most gut-wrenching part wasn't the blood, though there was plenty of it, soaking into the upholstery, dripping onto the asphalt in slow, rhythmic thuds. It was the realization that he had died in a state of absolute confusion and agony. There was no dignity in it. just the raw, biological reality of a body being shredded by steel and glass. I stood on the edge of the road and vomited until there was nothing left but bile, my eyes fixed on the twisted remains of the car door I had tried to hold shut. I haven't slept properly since that night. Every time I close my eyes, I see that car door closing. I feel the cold metal under my fingers, and I hear that voice. It haunts me more than the image of the bodies ever could, because the voice knew. It wasn't a guardian angel trying to save them. It felt more like a witness, a cold observer that was simply narrating the inevitable. Sometimes I'm sitting in a quiet room and the air will suddenly feel thin again. My stomach will drop and I'll wait, frozen, terrified that I'll hear that calm, ancient tone again, telling me that someone else I love is about to be erased from the world. It's the guilt that really eats at you, though. The knowledge that I was warned. I was given the chance to change the outcome, and I failed because I was afraid of looking weird. I keep wondering if that voice belongs to something that feeds on the grief it predicts. Because even now, years later, I can still hear it fading out in the back of my mind, a soft, mocking echo that reminds me every single day. Too late.
Next story. Next story is yours. Take a look at the shadow in the corner of your room. Are you sure it was that shape a minute ago? Subscribe or be the next in line.